So disputatio is essentially it's an academic exercise where people argue using formal logic, a thesis or a proposed question. I know you've already started, but as you continue to take Pastor Kalifungwa's class, you'll learn about formal logic and the different types of arguments and things like that, and you'll be required to use those same methods as you present and debate up here. So it was something that was started around 500 BC, and I think it's kind of evolved a little bit over time, but it was basically an informal, or rather in a formal disputatio, a thesis is offered in answer to a question. And then arguments in support of the thesis are then offered and objections against the thesis. And these are arguments that are considered and ideally refuted. So it's a sort of a conversation, back and forth discussions between people. For example, in answer to the question, is there free will? One could offer the following thesis. There is no free will. Then one would have to provide an argument in favor of this position. For example, all events are determined by prior causes. Whatever is determined by prior causes is not free. Therefore, our will is not free. That would be the conclusion. The opponent then offers an objection to the argument, to which the one who is defending the thesis replies, and so on. So you're using premises and conclusions and so on and so forth to build your argument, and you're going back and forth. And there are a few differences between debate and disputatio, two major ones that I consider. Firstly, debate usually is set in advance, where you're given a chance to prepare your arguments, you're given a certain time limit that you're supposed to speak, you have back and forths. And secondly, it's also competitive, where at the end of the debate, you have a winner, and that winner is determined by who brings out the most compelling arguments, who has presented themselves the best, who is just more persuasive, I suppose. Whereas in disputatio, it would happen without prior knowledge, where people have a logical discussion in response to a question. So typically it would happen right in the middle of a classroom. Your teacher is teaching, and then someone would have a question, and he decides, okay, let's go at it. Let's dispute. Let's go at it. And you'd have to use the formal logic to basically speak around this topic and come up with the best answers. And the goal of disputatio is to gain a better understanding of the question that's been given, and ultimately to pursue truth. So there's no winner or loser. It's about getting at the truth of something, which as Christians, truth is something that's very important to us because we serve a God of truth. So keep that in mind. So what is a classical Christian liberal arts education? That's a mouthful. So let's break it down. You've probably heard a little bit about this during orientation and as you've been starting class, but let's break it down one more time. You can never hear enough of this. So I'm going to offer two definitions of education. One is a modern definition that's given according to the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary, and that is education is a process of teaching, training, learning, especially in schools or colleges, to improve knowledge and develop skills. The end goal of modern education is to instruct. So someone has been educated. If a teacher has stood up in front of you and spoken to you, it doesn't really matter what you've learned or whether you've learned, as long as someone has done their part in speaking to you. And then I will give you Noah Webster's 1828 definition. Noah Webster was a Christian who realized the importance of defining words correctly and felt that God had called him to write a dictionary because, as we've seen, as the culture has progressed, the more you loosely define words or leave room for words to be defined freely, the more trouble you get into, because then people can throw in whatever narratives they want. People can decide what they want things to mean depending on what's comfortable for them. So he saw words as very important, and he decided to write a dictionary because he felt it was very important to define words concisely and correctly. So Noah Webster says education is the bringing up as of a child, instruction, formation of manners. Education comprehends all that series of instruction and discipline which is intended to enlighten the understanding, correct the temper, and form the manners and habits of youth, and fit them for usefulness in their future stations. To give children a good education in manners, arts, and science is important. To give them a religious education is indispensable, and an immense responsibility rests on parents and guardians who neglect these duties. So essentially, education is discipleship, and I think as Christians, this truly is what education is, because you go to school, we've been in school throughout our lives, and you think your teacher is just teaching you what 1 + 1 is, but really, because that's where you spend most of your time at, the people you're around, the curriculum that you use, those are the things that are essentially catechizing you and discipling you. So you might not realize other ways in which you've been influenced by it, but they might define it in this small way, but really, it is holistic. Noah Webster is just, really bringing it all together and saying that there should be an intention in educating people that way. Education is not amoral. We often think that it's something that doesn't have any moral implications on our lives. It's just, it's not right, it's not wrong. But it does have moral implications on our lives. What we learn in school, who we are educated by, what we are educated by, essentially either leads us towards God or away from God. A lot of us learn evolutionary theory in school and not biblical creation. That, in one way or another, is informing your worldview and is essentially taking you away from God. Whereas if you were learning a Christian education, you might learn about evolutionary theory, but you would learn that as a separate worldview. What you would be discipled in is biblical creation, because that fits into the coherent worldview of the Bible. So what is classical liberal arts? Classical liberal arts are the disciplines that are considered to be essential preparation for effective participation in public life. So like proper education, it is holistic and prepares you for life and not just a career. Remember that Webster's definition of education included manners and attitudes and all those things. It's not just about what you learn in school academically, but it addresses the whole of you, your entire being, including religion and all those other things. In the classical liberal arts, you've probably heard this already, it's basically grounded in what we call the trivium. And the trivium is basically grammar, logic, and rhetoric. These are sort of the levels of the classical liberal arts. There's also the quadrivium, which is not really part of our curriculum here, but I think it's just good to know. The quadrivium consists of astronomy or astrology, music, geometry, and arithmetic. These are more science-related. Classical education is language-focused, and this is important because it exercises your brain, whereas modern education allows the mind to be passive. So in a classical education, you're trained to constantly be thinking and questioning things and criticizing and basically asking questions, filtering things through a biblical worldview, because there's a lot of stuff that comes our way, but you need to be discerning to figure out what is true and what is not. And the beauty with classical education is that all knowledge is interrelated. So, for example, something like astronomy would be taught, and astronomy is the study of things beyond the Earth's atmosphere. So the moon, the stars, galaxies, whatever, everything beyond the Earth's atmosphere. So something like astronomy isn't studied in isolation. It's learned alongside the history of scientific discovery, which a lot of these things were happening around the time that the church was growing, and which leads into the church's relationship to science. It was considered heresy to believe certain things about outer space during this time in church history. If you believed that the earth was round at a time that the church believed the earth was flat, you could get into serious trouble for that. And from there, that leads us to the controversies of the medieval church. So you would never think that learning something like astrology would ever connect to church history, but in classical education, you're able to draw those connections because all knowledge is interrelated. So yeah, that's about that. So just getting back into the trivium, ACU primarily focuses on the trivium, and ideally the trivium in classical education should be taught from the time that you begin school. So the first level is the grammar stage, and the grammar stage would normally happen during the early years of learning, little children, early years of primary school, during a time that their memorizing faculties are, really, I guess, enhanced. For children, memorizing is fun. So at this stage, you'll hear a lot of words like metaphysics and epistemology, and you'll be required to memorize those things. Of course, it's going to be a little bit difficult for us now, because this is not quite an ideal situation, but it's still a great opportunity anyway. So in the grammar stage, this consists of just facts, data, terms. It's the building blocks. It's the most basic things. You define the terms. It's just basic knowledge, the A's, B's, and C's of everything, of knowledge. And then we have the logic phase. The logic phase would ideally happen towards the end of your primary education and perhaps during the early years of your secondary education. And the logic phase is basically the understanding level, how the facts fit together. Knowing that CAT, which are just individual facts, when you put together form the word cat. So you ask the questions why, you ask the questions what. You're trying to make sense of these things that you've been learning. And then you have the rhetoric stage, which is you'd learn typically toward the end of your secondary school education. So as I speak of these timelines, this is sort of how it's going to happen during your time here. In the scholars program, it's more, the grammar stage. You'll be learning terms. You have to do a lot of memorization, Bible verses, things like that. You'll learn Latin. Takes a lot of memorization. As you get to first, second year, you'll do a lot more logic. You'll be asked to speak, to make sense of the things that you've been learning. And by the time you get to fourth year and you leave, you'd be expected to be able to express the ideas that you've learned here in a winsome manner. You'd be able to use the knowledge that you've learned here properly. So that's what rhetoric is. It's wisdom. It's proper use of knowledge and understanding and being able to communicate that in an effective way. So grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the trivium. So what makes it Christian? Why do we call it Christian? Classical education is great, but without a biblical worldview, it can be just that. You'll learn a lot of great things, but once again, it can have the tendency to lead you away from God and not toward Him. So we call it Christian because the biblical worldview is the only worldview that ties everything together. There is nothing that you can imagine in this world that doesn't make sense within a biblical worldview. Anything and everything you can imagine that happens in life makes perfect sense when viewed through the lens of Scripture. So essentially, this is what ties everything together because the Bible offers us a cohesive worldview. Being a Christian means that you have a personal relationship with God through the work of Christ on the cross. And when this happens, we ought to be changed radically because we become alive to the truth. However, we do not just come to know this truth by accident, but by studying God's word, which means that the things found in the Bible are the things that should change our outlook on life. The things that are found in the Bible are the things that should influence our worldview. And to get more on this, you should read Romans 12 and see how Paul calls us to conform our minds and to present ourselves as living sacrifices. That all starts with knowing the Bible and then being conformed by it. Apologetics is essentially the practice of defending the faith through argumentation. And the Bible verse on which the art and practice of apologetics rests on is 1 Peter 3, verse 15, which says, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." This requires tying in the trivium to apologetics, what we've just learned. Essentially, apologetics is knowing what you believe, which if you think about it is grammar, just knowing the facts, knowing why you believe it, the logic stays, the A, B's, and C's, tying them all together, and being able to communicate that in a winsome manner, rhetoric, right? So applying it well and being able to communicate it. So this requires that we are well educated, and in our setting, the training ground that we have for doing this is Disputatio. So on this ground, we're given the chance to really sharpen those skills, to think through certain things, to come up with arguments, to be able to defend our positions, to express ourselves well, to interact with other ideas, to criticize them, to know why we reject them, why we believe what we believe, and so on and so forth. So this is essentially what makes it Christian. And you'll realize that it's not just going to prepare you for, having to stand in front of people here, but living your life out in the world. The context for this Bible verse in 1 Peter is suffering. The context of it is suffering. Basically, the idea is that when someone asks you, why is it that you continue to hold to this faith, even though you suffer for it, Paul is still able to give a defense for this because he knows what he believes. He knows why he believes it. And for us, Christ told us that if we believe in him, we will suffer for it. And in the world, there will be many times that you will suffer for your faith. And if someone comes to you and asks you, why didn't you take that opportunity to steal this or steal that or cheat on this quiz? And you'll be able to say no, because it's wrong. I have morals. I believe in an absolute truth. And in that moment, you'll be giving a defense of your faith, essentially. So take Disputatio seriously, because that is essentially what it's training us for formal discussions like this, formal presentations like this, formal debates, but also, once again, to really be able to express yourselves well out there, because many people will ask about your faith. And yes, it's great that you can live it out, but it's even better if you can actually have good and intelligent conversations with people about it, because it's not just a faithy, feely thing. The Bible actually addresses, many issues that the world has to throw at us. Remember, it's a cohesive worldview. So there are answers out there to the questions that people may have. So in summary, Disputatio is the platform that displays and refines our ability to persuasively express what we believe, why we believe it. It is the platform upon which wisdom and eloquence meet.